My name's Alan Moore. I write comics. When I started in comics 4 or 5 years ago, we didn't get no respect. It was a case where comics were seen as a juvenile medium where they were throwaway items. They were just cheap four-colour trash. That's changed. Over the last 4 or 5 years, you've had comics done on every subject from sort of homosexual rights to the Holocaust in the Second World War. The range of subject matter has widened immensely. We are actually dealing with adult stories now. So listen here, you dandified get. Just who the hell do you think you are? I'm Alan Moore. I'm a comic book messiah for the 1990s. And having risen from my humble Terrace Street origins and having survived my tenure as one of the Dole Q millions, I've now become a successful small businessman of no mean repute, and I believe that this is the face of success in Mrs. Thatcher's Britain. You mean somebody actually pays you? You make a living out of all this? What the hell do you do? I do comics. I do, well, any sort of writing pertaining to comics.
Comic writer then? You just write comics?
Oh, I write comics, and I consider that to be as worthy as any other form of endeavour. You wouldn't have said to Stravinsky that he just did music.
Oh, so it's art, is it? You're a purveyor of culture. Well, what is this art that we should be thanking you for, then?
Yeah, I'd say it was art. Comics, on the other hand, are a little bit better than most art, because any kid who's got 30 pence in his pocket, 40 pence, can go down to the corner newsagents and buy a piece of work that people have put a lot of honest endeavour into. It's not something that you have to have a sort of a charge account to appreciate. It's not something that you need a vast education in the classics to appreciate. It's something that is within reach of anybody. There is a red and angry world. Red things happen there. The world eats your wife, eats your friends, eats all the things that make you human. And you become a monster. And the world just keeps on eating.
The original Swamp Thing was portrayed as a man who somehow had turned into this weird hybrid plant creature. When I took over in '82, I decided to change it around. What I did was to make it a plant with delusions of grandeur. A plant that had somehow managed to convince itself that it was a human being. And having done that, I found that I'd got a character with possibilities that went far beyond those of the general mainstream of comics characters. The issues that Swamp Thing deals with are ones that are very rarely touched upon in other comics.
I stand in an orchard of street signs and parking meters. From across the wilderness city, the wind blows fragments of music, percussive, robotic, distant. My consciousness seeps out through the filaments and shoots. In Coventry, the Residents' Protection Group creep through an overgrown department store bristling with guns and tension. In the cosmetics department, an escaped tiger treads carefully through the spilled lipsticks. In one episode of Swamp Thing, we had an entire tropical rainforest bursting up through the streets of New York and smothering the city in vegetation. In the resultant chaos and carnage, all of the animals escaped from the local zoo, so that you have parakeets roosting on top of street lamps and escaped tigers padding through the cosmetics department at a local chain store. What we were trying to suggest is that even though mankind can cover nature and smother the wilderness with a layer of concrete and cement, even though mankind can erect huge, powerful and impressive looking buildings, that underneath our feet, underneath the buried pipes and the buried cables, nature is still there. The wilderness is still there. And though man might boast of having conquered nature, that's not the case. For if nature were to shrug or to merely raise its eyebrow, then we should all be gone.
since the Industrial Revolution. We've had a situation where you almost get mankind pitted against the environment. If you hear the way that people have talked about the relationship between man and nature, it's been in terms of man triumphing over nature, of man beating back nature and imposing his own will upon the natural world. We are incredibly arrogant about the planet that we're living on. We somehow assume that we can do anything to the world and it'll always be there and it will always look after us, and that's not the case. It's okay ignoring that stuff because it's too depressing or too frightening. It's okay ignoring wiping out of various species because, well, you know, I mean, what's a panda or two between friends? Do the blue whales really matter to us that much? This organism that we're living on, this planet, is so incredibly finely balanced that whatever befalls the earth, befalls the sons of the earth. If you spit upon the earth, you spit upon mankind.
One of my favourite sequences in Swamp Thing is where he realises that with all of his vast powers, he could actually do something towards saving the world. I could do it. Could restore Africa's crumbling topsoil to the loam from which rich jungles sprang. And why stop there? Why not rebuild the forests of the Amazon, less green now than an average suburbia and shrinking by the day? I could drop grapes into the mouths of all the hungry children, turn the Gobi and Sahara into green and rippling meadows, give the widows roses and the old men strawberries. For am I not a god? I could touch all this world with wilderness as I touch Gotham, could transform this planet to a sphere of perfumes, colours and full bellies. I could save mankind. I could do anything. Anything. But of course, once he's considered all the implications, Swamp Thing does nothing, coming to the following conclusions. Is this then what it is to be a god? To know and never do? To watch the world wind by and in its windings find content? If I should feed the world, heal all the wounds man's smouldering industries have made, what would he do? Would he renounce the wealth his sawmills bring? Step gently on the flowers instead and pluck each apple with respect for this abundant world in all its providence? No. He would pump more poisons, build more mines, safe in the knowledge that I stood on hand to mend the biosphere, endlessly covering the scars he could now endlessly inflict. The world at the moment seems to be a bit of a runaway train. It's getting faster and faster and faster. Nobody has got the faintest idea what the hell is going on. But one thing that is certain is that it's all changing, and it's changing really, really rapidly. And you've got kids who are supposed to make some sense of this huge and imposing world that's looming over us when they've barely been able to make sense of the world that we've had for the past 20 years. And to do that, I don't really think personally that the education system's up to it. What I think is that people these days get their information from all of the much despised sort of vulgar media sources that people have been trying so hard to ban for the past 40 years. Television, movies, comics, rock and roll records. That is the main way that kids sort of soak up all this info. So if in these sort of basically silly sort of funny books and things I can actually get over some information, if I can help the education process in a bright four-colour comic book way that kids are actually going to want to read, then I'd say that's enough of a contribution. If I thought I'd done that, I think I'd be happy. Do I see a hint of an ego problem creeping in here? Might you say that you had just the slightest touch of a messiah complex? Well, would I have a haircut like this if I didn't? I think we're all entitled to a little messiah complex of our own, as long as it doesn't involve taking up arms or sort of going around and crucifying anybody else. So who in this vast world of ours is this doing the slightest bit of good for? Could it be you, perhaps? It's good for me, obviously, and hopefully it's maybe good for the people who read it. Yeah, we get letters from sort of kids. These are not sort of wild-eyed Manson converts, but they're kids who may have read something that I've written and decide that, Yeah, perhaps they have changed their mind about this facet or that facet. We get a lot of kids writing in to disagree, and that's healthy as well, as long as they're thinking. I don't want everybody to agree with me, I just want people to think.
What I'm trying to do is to take some possibly unpopular political beliefs and to make them accessible, to give ideas that are quite large and complex to children in a form that they can understand. I would much rather put out my stories to children, to people who do not share my political beliefs at all, because in that instance I am not preaching to the converted. Given that I've got, say, 500,000 readers a month, if only 10% of those, or 1% of those, take notice of what I'm saying, that is still a very large number of people.
Everyone thinks they're such sweet little ducks, ducks. Soft downy feathers and nice little ducks, ducks. But there's a poison I'd like to administer. You think they're cuddly, but I think they're sinister. Ducks, ducks. Dressed in plaid jackets and horrible shoes, getting divorces and turning to booze. Ducks, ducks. Look closer and you may recoil in surprise at web-footed fascists with mad little eyes. Ducks, ducks. If they hadn't done anything wrong, the people wouldn't keep shooting them. Ducks, ducks, ducks.
Now, come on, what's this business with ducks? Isn't that a little bit psychotic? What the hell have you got against ducks? What have I got against ducks? Well, that was perhaps just a passing phase in my youth. It's like when you get Tory MPs asked why they were members of the National Front until 2 weeks ago last Tuesday. I have to put it down to an indiscretion of my younger days, basically. But they are pretty vile when you think about it, aren't they? Now, I'm going to read you a cautionary favour. I want you to listen to this intently, all right? So that it will hopefully improve your loathsome table manners. This is a story about a boy called Timothy Tate, okay? Yeah. This is the tale of Timothy Tate, a child too vile to contemplate. Obese, belligerent and rude, young Timmy was obsessed by food. Whole sides of beef and legs of mutton could not appease this little glutton. He'd wolf down trifles by the score, lick clean his plate and scream for more. As if afflicted by a curse, his appetites grew more diverse. Despite his parents' frosty stares, he'd often gnaw through legs of chairs. He'd munch with unashamed glee through carpets and upholstery, and household pets too slow to flee would often vanish utterly. The parents of his friends, in fear, forbade their offspring to go near, lest they should end up as a feast for this demented little beast. He'd stalked alone, shunned by his peers in verdant woodlands growing near, and at the tremor of his tread, the timid forest creatures fled. One evening, as he dined on twigs, a sound disturbed this prince of pigs, and looking up, saw something bright descending from the starry night. The glowing disc dropped from the sky towards a leafy glade nearby, and from its hatch, as Timmy hid, a brace of curious creatures slid. Who knows from what dim distant star this puzzling pair had journeyed far, but Tim, his beady eyes alert, had but one thought, which was dessert.
The Comics Code in America has had some quite specific laws drawn up about how to treat things like violence and sex in comics. It's, I suppose, a precursor of the Rambo mentality, where you can show horrific violence happening, hot lead flying everywhere, nobody gets scratched. And I've had people attack my books because they show a childbirth, or because they show violence realistically, with the blood, because they show human sexuality, hopefully realistically, because they show human politics realistically. And I've had people saying that this is destroying the innocence of childhood, you know, sort of how can you push this sort of depressing, sordid, real-world filth down the mouths of our kids?
I mean, the main thing that seems to irritate them seems to me to be political, in that they want us to show superheroes and other comic characters as perpetual Boy Scouts. They don't want us to show a world in which authority can ever be corrupt or in which anything ever goes wrong. And the main thing that they cite as a reason for this is that it is harmful to the small and vulnerable minds of children, which obviously I'm a parent myself. I mean, I've got Leah and Amber. And basically my feeling is that the world that we have been careless enough to leave laying around for our children to inherit is a place which is sometimes hostile, which is sometimes dangerous, which has got a lot of very frightening edges to it. And the only way that I can help my children, the only real sort of chance that I can give them of securing their emotional and physical and psychological survival is to actually tell them about the stuff that's going on in the world. If there are sort of nuclear pollutants and poisons laying around, let's tell them about that. If there are psychopaths lurking upon every street corner, they should know. I don't think that it does children any service to present them this artificial, pastel-coloured Care Bear world in which everybody is friendly, everybody wants to hug each other. Listen, Pally boy, there's people who fought in Dunkirk in the last war, and if you ask them about all of this, they'd think that it was a load of bollocks. I wouldn't say that. Recently, I've been working with a group called the CCCO in America, which is helping conscientious objectors. Maybe if there'd been people doing comics like the one that we're intending to do, which will be working with actual servicemen giving their memory of what real life was like in the forces, maybe if there'd been more people back then who were able to point out just what the reality of warfare was, maybe some of those people who were at Dunkirk would have more limbs or fingers than they had now, or less dead friends. Oh, well, in that case, forgive me, not just bollocks then, subversive bollocks. Is that the case? It seems to me that anything these days which is slightly to the left of Genghis Khan is immediately labelled subversive. If in our schools children are taught that there shouldn't be antagonism and disharmony between black kids and white kids, if they're taught that it's perhaps not the nicest thing in the world to shout abuse at homosexuals in the street, this is immediately labelled as subversive and a danger to the fabric of our great nation. If in this current time tolerance and sensitivity of any kind are labelled loony left or subversive, then I would be quite proud to be considered a subversive. We did an episode of Swamp Thing entitled The Nuke Face Papers, which dealt with this horribly irradiated wino called Nuke Face, who used to drink nuclear sludge instead of methylated spirits. And we'd have him walking through the swamps, leaving luminous blue footprints wherever he trod, and the fruit would be growing riper and rotting and falling off the trees as he passed. At the end of the story, we have him waking up after most of the other characters believe that he's dead, but in fact he's just been sleeping off a hangover. And we have him rise to his feet and realise that he's got no more of the nuclear waste which he needs to sustain him. So we have him stumbling off into the bayous, just this wrecked and sort of debilitated figure, and he's saying, I know that there's some more of it out there somewhere, and if I have to look all over this country, I'm going to find it. If I have to look in every state, in every neighbourhood, in every street, I'm going to find it. And then he walks off into the bayou, just shambling, leaving the dead grass behind him, poisoning everything he touches. And he says, Heads up, America! Here I come! When we did that episode, to underline the threat, we had actual newspaper clippings blowing through the swamp that we'd taken from various newspapers that we'd read concerning nuclear waste spillages and steam escapes and things like that. Particularly, we used a lot of clippings from the test areas in Utah where the Americans dropped their atom bombs. These were clippings from school teachers who'd said, yes, I can remember the children coming in every morning to school and saying, did you see it, Mrs. Kelsey? Did you see the flash? And there were even more distressing ones from parents who said, yes, it was a big deal out here to watch the mushroom clouds glow up. We used to take the children out in their bathing costumes to watch. And after we published the issue, we got an awful lot of response from the readers saying it was a great story, but all those clippings you used, they weren't real, were they? But of course, they were.
And there's an old Chinese adage that if the artist does not feel excited or sad or happy when he's drawing the picture, he has no right to expect the audience to feel those emotions. You have to invest a work of art with a degree of intensity, an intensity of feeling upon your part, in order for that to communicate.
Well, come on, I mean, what makes you special? I mean, you're just a jerk like everybody else. What makes you think that you know what's going on? I know as well as anybody else is what is going on. That all that anybody upon this particular planet can do, finding themselves surrounded by a web of information, much of which might be untrue, some of which may be valid, they have to make up their own mind. They have to think as much as they can about what is right, try to work out what courses of action seem to be the most pro-survival, which courses of action are going to make things a little bit better and certainly not hurt anybody else.
As somebody who lived through the latter part of the 60s and the early 70s, obviously I believe that people's minds can be changed. That if you shout about something vehemently enough, it might make a difference. It is obviously a very big factor if you're planning a power plant, just what the political consensus is in the area where you're planning to build it. If there are an awful lot of people who are fanatically anti-nuclear, it might just be better to sort of leave that area alone and build it somewhere else. There is no doubt about it that this is an element in 1980s politics. That if you're going to have to go through a massive fight with local protest groups, you can add another $500,000 onto your costs. It hits people in the wallet, which, I mean, like, I think that really it would be naive to expect to sort of hit them in the conscience.
What do the dead people think about on those long and sleepless nights beneath the ground when the tree roots press against their backs like wrinkles in the bed sheets? Do they watch the miniature dynasties of beetles unfold before their gaze and give names to them, repeating themselves often? Do they spend 50 years trying to remember what peaches smelled like? What do the dead think about? And what do they think of us? In Western society, we seem to be unduly terrified by the idea of death, without ever realising that death is the only thing that gives life any of its sweetness. There's a wonderful anecdote about a Zen monk who found himself in the unenviable position of dangling from a cliff top by a single strawberry bush, which he was hanging onto for dear life, which had a single ripe, succulent strawberry hanging from the end of its branch. And just below this dangling monk, there was a savage man-eating tiger waiting for him to fall, leaping up around his feet, snapping and growling and clawing at him. And the monk hangs there and he thinks, shall I eat the strawberry now? And he does. And as he eats it, on the way down, it tastes absolutely perfect. Tiny measured cries as if slowly immersed in water that's too icy or too hot, her fingers scrabble. Unleashed dogs upon my park green back, shredded and crushed, small leaves and petals fall, she loves me not. I am the limpet armoured rock, she is the tide, the white foam streaming down her neck, her shoulders. Sea and shore we clash together, fall asunder, clash together, fall. She loves me. There is a tender junction where the worlds of plant and animal converge. I am the veldt, her muscles flow across me like a herd of sleek and leaping ibex, and she's howling like a zoo, she's screaming like a forest fire. She loves me not. Her world and mine locked into a collision orbit, spinning faster, winding tighter, desperate for our final impact, our sublime apocalypse, and oh, and oh, and oh, and oh, and oh, she loves me.
In the course of doing Watchmen, what we tried to do was to set up a fabulous analogy for the way that life actually is in the 1980s. It's the fears, obsessions, hopes and aspirations of myself as writer and Dave as artist, translated into very baroque, fabulous terms and people in costumes. It's a sort of a little morality play. I think the problem is in the 80s that everybody feels so impotent. And that is a perfect excuse for never attempting to do anything. Consequently, what I found I had to do was to actually examine some of these fears and phobias and see what it was about them that frightened me. And one of the things that hangs heavily over the heads of everybody is the nuclear issue. Because for the first time, there is a strong possibility of everybody dying on the same day. And I think that it's not stretching a point too far to say that if every concept you've ever loved, if every ideal you've ever cherished, every person, every institution could be completely levelled and wiped away as if it had never been within the next 4 minutes, then what wouldn't you do? When you see the whole world geared up for that sort of act of mass destruction, then a Charles Manson or a Richard Speck or a Yorkshire Ripper becomes the merest bumbling amateur. It doesn't even matter whether we ever fire these missiles or not. They are having their effect upon us now, because there are a generation growing up who cannot see beyond the final exclamation mark of a mushroom cloud. There are a generation who can see no moral values that do not end in a crackling crater somewhere.
My name's Alan Moore. I write comics. When I started in comics 4 or 5 years ago, we didn't get no respect. It was a case where comics were seen as a juvenile medium where they were throwaway items. They were just cheap four-colour trash. That's changed. Over the last 4 or 5 years, you've had comics done on every subject from sort of homosexual rights to the Holocaust in the Second World War. The range of subject matter has widened immensely. We are actually dealing with adult stories now. So listen here, you dandified git. Just who the hell do you think you are? I'm Alan Moore. I'm a comic book messiah for the 1990s. And having risen from my humble Terrace Street origins and having survived my tenure as one of the Dole Q millions, I've now become a successful small businessman of no mean repute, and I believe that this is the face of success in Mrs. Thatcher's Britain. You mean somebody actually pays you? You make a living out of all this? What the hell do you do? I do comics. I do, well, any sort of writing pertaining to comics.
Comic writer then, you just write comics?
Oh, I write comics, and I consider that to be as worthy as any other form of endeavour. You wouldn't have said to Stravinsky that he just did music.
Oh, so it's art, is it? You're a purveyor of culture. Well, what is this art that we should be thanking you for, then?
Yeah, I'd say it was art. Comics, on the other hand, are a little bit better than most art, because any kid who's got 30 pence in his pocket, 40 pence, can go down to the corner newsagents and buy a piece of work that people have put a lot of honest endeavour into. It's not something that you have to have a sort of a charge account to appreciate. It's not something that you need a vast education in the classics to appreciate. It's something that is within reach of anybody. Good night, children, and sweet dreams, wherever you are.